Hello, everyone, and welcome to the internal Xenium Managing Protected Leaves training. This is your trainer, Molly Kelly, Senior Human Resource Business Partner, and I'm joining you today to guide you through a training that we've prepared and utilized quite successfully for several clients over the years, just to kind of help guide them in straightening out this very convoluted process of managing protected leaves. This session is actually meant to pair with training that I recorded a few months ago regarding the internal workings, the kind of backside of this in terms of how Xenium human resource business partners and account reps handle navigating through this. But we thought it would be helpful for you to see the same training that we present to our clients as well, in terms of getting their managers and supervisors and leads up to speed on what they need to know about leaves. There's been a lot of activity and dramatic changes in the last even few weeks here. I'm recording this on January 15th, 2016, and we just had the passage of the now statewide Oregon sick leave, which went into effect on the first of the year, so just 14 short days ago. And is still a really, really gray area for a lot of people. So I think this will be a hot topic, and we thought it would be a useful tool for our business partners and trainees at all levels in HR to sort of see the kind of walkthrough that we would be giving new clients and new managers on this very interesting, convoluted puzzle. So the challenge is navigating all of these different pieces as they fit together, and it seems to only get more and more complicated. It used to be that we would have FEMLA, which is the federal leave, and then we start folding in individual state leaves. So Washington and Oregon have their own variations on this. California, I think, has about 80 different variations on leave, both paid and unpaid leave. So we've got those pieces, and we're starting to see cities as well coming up with paid and unpaid leaves, which just makes it even more complicated. So with the state and local laws, as well as disability elements related to ADA, it gets very, very complex. Sometimes we have an element of work comp going on in the background as well. So as you can see from our little image there, it can be extremely stressful to try to navigate this scene. And so we want to make sure that you're aware of all the support that we have available to you to guide your clients successfully. So what we're typically covering when we present this training to managers, leads, supervisors, and other HR folks is an understanding of the responsibilities around leave and disability. I'm always very impressed with how little notice is required for some of these conversations that managers and supervisors are engaging in every day with their employees. There's not a magic waving red flag that says, hey, I'm claiming FEMLA time. And it's very easy for a manager or supervisor to miss that moment when the company is essentially being put on notice. So we want to be clear about what the responsibilities are in the process behind the scenes of taking care of those requests when they come up. That also would include an awareness of how to handle performance. There's a lot of myths out there around the idea that when somebody's on leave, I can't manage performance at all. I can't address anything that's come before their leave if there was pre-existing performance issues as well. And that we certainly can't fire anybody for 2 years after their completion of a work comp claim or a leave of absence, which is just not true. So knowing that they've got managers and leads out there who are really uncertain of how to handle performance conversations in light of leave and work comp claims, it's a hot topic. What worries me even more is the managers and supervisors and leads who don't know that that's a very fraught area. So the folks who will lunge in and terminate for poorly documented reasons in light of or around work comp or leaves of absence claims. So there needs to be a balance between sensitivity and awareness of managing performance and the issues and challenges that are presented with concerns around retaliation, and of course, not an oversensitivity to it. So that's kind of the fine line that we are blessed with walking every day. So then we'll also outline our process and resources and then support difficult conversations as well. And a lot of that kind of dialogue we try to do through role play. So I won't spend as much time on that today in our training together, but just want you guys to see what we typically would be leading folks through. So the attorneys affectionately call this the Bermuda Triangle, with the idea that you go in there and you never come out. You wander around lost. And that's been my experience on multiple occasions when these things tend to bleed together. So we have at the Apex ADA and, of course, the expanded ADA laws from 2008 that are ADAAA, or as I like to call it, ADAAAAAA. That is now in the background for us in a lot of leave situations because the definition of disability is so broad. So we'll drill down into that a little bit and get more specific about how that can play into these situations. And then we have family medical leave at all of these different levels. Specifically, the ones that we would encounter most here at Xenium are FEMLA, which is the Federal Family Medical Leave, OFLA, which is Oregon Family Medical Leave, and WFLA, which that's an acronym I made up, or actually the acronym's been around for a while, but my pronunciation on it, affectionately, and that's Washington Family Medical Leave Act. And now we have Oregon Sick Leave, which is the predecessor of that leave, of Oregon Sick Leave, was actually the Portland Sick Leave and Eugene Sick Leaves, which have now been kind of enfolded within a statewide leave. So those are probably the most common. Of course, you have clients that are operating in other states that might have one-off situations. We are really, really lucky to have an amazing leave coordinator on our team in Sherry Utley. So Sherry knows this stuff inside and out. She is our resource for all of the leaves that you see listed here, as well as the one-offs that are maybe in Seattle-Tacoma area and have other specific regulations, or Arkansas. If you're not sure whether a state has state-specific leave laws, Sherry's a great resource for that as well, too. And sometimes we can have workers' comp at play as well. And there are moments when some of those other state or local leaves disappear in the presence of work comp. And there are times when we still have a leave rolling along behind it. So knowing how to handle those pieces and how these things all play out is kind of what we're going to be focusing on today. So to start us off, we'll look at the Americans with Disabilities Act, which essentially starts off with a very firm declaration of non-discrimination in employment. So this is around initially it was around providing equal access to employment for all candidates and employees. Keeping in mind that candidates is in there too, not just employees or current employees. So essentially, a lot of this initially under ADA, before the 2008 adjustments, was aimed at physical adaptations to space. So for instance, wheelchair access, things like that, modifications to work practices or workstations. If there was visual challenges for someone, maybe getting them a larger monitor or a special monitor that amplifies the font size, things like that. That was for a long time. That was our main focus, and it also was our focus in terms of looking at a disability that was fairly permanent. That has really changed with the changes in the 2008 law, which expands it out substantially to temporary limitations as well. So if there was a disability that was in play for, let's say, my experience, I had a situation where a gentleman turned his ankle to the point where he actually shattered it in a church softball league and had a 8-month recovery process. And it was initially going to be a 3-month recovery process, and somebody botched something in the surgery, so he needed more time. So we played out through not just FEMLA and OFLA, as he was an Oregon employee, and was covered under both the state and the federal law. But once those two leaves had been exhausted, we didn't, of course, just terminate him. We began discussing what additional accommodations he might need. And in this case, the most obvious one was he couldn't go back to his job where he was standing on a concrete floor for 8 hours a day for quite some time, because he needed a second surgery and then a second recovery period. So in this case, one of the accommodations that we made was giving him additional time off. And that whole process, that back and forth around the employee saying, I can't come back from leave, or I'm getting migraines due to the lighting at work, or I have fragrance sensitivity and I need additional support. That initial request for support is a request for accommodation. At which point the employer, it's like a ping pong match, a tennis game, or a good cha-cha. The employer then takes the lead and lobs back over the net a return serve, which is, all right, well, let me know what you need. So basically asking the employee to define the nature of the support that they need. And that comes in the form of a fitness for duty, which goes off to the doctor, the employee's doctor. And the doctor completes it, sends it back to us, and it asks all kinds of questions around their need for accommodation. So it gives us some really good medical information about what kinds of accommodations are needed. At that point, we're not committing to anything. We're just reviewing the information and the requests and looking at whether an accommodation as requested is a reasonable accommodation or an undue hardship. And if it's an undue hardship, we really need to be secure in pushing back and saying, there's no way we can make this work. The most common argument for undue hardship is financial. And I'll warn you that I heard from an attorney years and years ago that that's not a very strong argument, because essentially, if you make a financial argument and things are pushed to the point of going to court where there's some kind of legal action and they feel that there should have been accommodations made, if you argue financially that it's not a commitment that the company it was not a reasonable accommodations, not a commitment the company could make, then essentially you are opening up your entire financial books to the court systems and the attorneys to review. And if there is a request for accommodation by, let's say, adding a $5,000 wheelchair ramp, and the company has said, no, we can't do that. But meanwhile, we spent over $10,000 flying the executives to a corporate spa in Vegas, that will become an issue. So we really try to look at what can we do, what is reasonable. A lot of the time, the conversation dwells around, okay, if we make this accommodation, what challenges are going to be befalling the rest of the employee base. So with scent sensitivity or fragrance sensitivity, how many other folks are impacted by this request? And, if we go completely fragrance free, what kind of an adjustment does that make? Is it enforceable? All those things. A wonderful resource for assessing this would be the Job Accommodation Network, which is a website. Its nickname is Jan, and you'll see that it's listed down below here, askjan.org. I'd really encourage you to poke around on this and kind of get a sense of what's listed there in terms of all the different situations, disabilities that can come up for folks, and a list of sort of what each one is and how you can possibly accommodate these situations. It's a wonderful, creative resource. I've been amazed at how many additional ideas can come to mind. And sometimes the accommodation that the employee is initially requesting can be adjusted in light of ideas that come from Jan to something that maybe works a little bit better for the rest of the group or for the employer themselves. So the important thing to keep in mind right now, though, is that as HR business partners or HR representatives, we are not doctors, and we're also not attorneys. And if this situation goes to, gets contentious and winds up, in a legal battle, you definitely want to have really, truly exhausted your exploration of the interactive process, which hopefully is also very well documented. So there's a whole kind of a background process around documentation of the interactive process that we can outline for you as well. You can discuss that with your manager. But essentially, most of us tend to loop in senior HR business partners or directors, or Tana if she's available. And often we're routing to legal to really explore this situation as to whether or not we fully have accommodated and explored the interactive process appropriately. So when we mentioned that in 2008, ADA was expanded out significantly, the new definition is, does the employee, we'll use in this case, have a substantial impairment in his or her ability to engage in a major life activity. So there has to be a major impact on one of these listed areas. And, a couple examples would be somebody who is struggling with infertility. If you look on the left side, there's procreation listed on that column. Certainly, we're all aware of challenges around, walking or standing, things like that. But, certainly situations around attention deficit disorder or, dyslexia, things like that could impact the day-to-day work that someone's doing. I think it's also really important to note communication. So if we have somebody who is suffering from bipolar disorder and is prone to outbursts of, kind of irrational or angry conversation, it's very quick for easy for an employer to quickly move to termination because of unprofessional behavior and impact within the workplace. But we need to make sure we're exploring this if the employee has made some kind of an indication to someone that they have a disability of that nature. And that's, of course, the big problem, is that these things are all very deeply personal. Most people don't wear T-shirts that have their disability listed on them, so we can quickly say, oh, it looks like so-and-so has ADHD. Okay. So a lot of these things we encounter as performance challenges, and there could be an underlying medical issue going on. But we're also asked to not be doctors and play the role of diagnosing whatever's going on. So there's definitely a danger in perceiving a disability at the same time. So the real rule of thumb is, if the employee has made a statement to a peer that then gets to the management team, or certainly if they've made a statement to a manager or a supervisor or a lead, anybody in a position of authority, the company is considered to be on notice of a disability. So you want to be very cautious and very careful and work closely with your leadership team here at Xenium when you're navigating these situations, especially if they're newer for you. This is such a great, ripe learning area. There's so much to learn here, but it is sort of like walking through a minefield where we want to make sure we're being careful and appropriate with our communication around the issue as well. So we move to the Family Medical Leave Act, which is the federal Family Medical Leave Act. And before I segue from ADA into FEMLA, just a reminder that all of these areas, as I mentioned in the previous slide, are deeply protected, but whether it be through GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which is conditions that I might get in the future or I might be prone to, or ADA, which is conditions that I might have right now, to Family Medical Leave Act, which might also get into either my or my family's personal health information. So there's a lot of confidentiality in these processes, and I think that's a really good reminder to give, especially new managers and supervisors and leads who may not be conscious of how deeply private these situations are. They shouldn't be discussing the specifics of somebody's leave of absence, even if they were shared, the employee shared that information openly with other coworkers. It's a huge no-no. And oftentimes we as HR folks are in more knowledge or have more knowledge of what's going on than, let's say, line leads or supervisors or managers. The employee maybe opens up to us about what's going on. So there's a fine line that we're all walking around. And certainly in the previous example of ADA, we want to also be careful that we're not speculating about performance issues being related to a medical condition until someone has basically shared that they are directly related to a medical condition on paper, in writing, things like that. Anything that could come back to haunt us in terms of perception of a disability. But when an employee makes a request for family medical leave, usually we can move to paper pretty quickly because it's a pretty straightforward process. So we often have a leave request form. Some of the things that we're looking for is whether or not the employer and the employee both qualify. So the Family Medical Leave Act is, again, nationwide, so every state is subject to this. We must have 50 or more employees to qualify. If we have a close reporting relationship between an external employee who does not have a home base, so maybe they're working from their home, from, or they're working from home and reporting into an organization in a state, that can sometimes increase the state's, head count. So for Oregon, we have 25 employees for Oregon Family Medical Leave. If we had 3 or 4 people who were based around the country reporting into Oregon, that could tip a 22-person company into OFLA qualifying status. With Family Medical Leave Act, it's pretty straightforward at the federal level, but there is a 50-mile radius that we're also considering in terms of whether or not the employer qualifies. So that should count, a lot of the outlying locations in the same city per se. So what we're looking at in terms of what the employee is granted is they have to have worked a minimum of 1,250 hours in the last 12 months. So it's a pretty straightforward qualification base. And they're looking at pretty much that equates to almost full-time. So typically it's full-time. There are qualifying exigency elements in here that relate to military situations. There were some recent updates in light of the Iraq and Afghani wars that kind of created some new additional protections for military caregivers and folks who needed time away. Qualifying exigency essentially speaks to the idea of needing time away to prepare for military duty or come home from military duty, things like that. So we have lots of resources that you can read up on that if you want more information. Most commonly, though, we see the 12 weeks of job-protected leave being applied for birth, newly adopted or foster children, children, spouse, parent with a serious health condition, or most notably the employee's own serious health condition. So it's 12 weeks. For most folks, although the military caregivers receive up to 26 weeks. And we have the same protections that we would in OFLA, most commonly, for reinstatement. So essentially the employee leaves their job, assuming they're coming back to the same or an equivalent job. The same pay, the same benefits, the same shift, similar duties. There's a lot of attention paid to the importance of making sure they're coming back to their same job. This is not a paid leave at a federal level at this time. So this is basically just job protection to give you time to take, whether it's in one big chunk or intermittently, which is kind of coming and going, leaving early for appointments, things like that, as needed. Oregon Family Medical Leave Act is more generous than the Federal Family Medical Leave Act. So you see that we have a shorter qualification period, which is actually a 6-month qualification period, about, minimum of 180 days worked. And it also extends in some cases to part-time folks. We have 14 days leave for spouses for military deployment, and then we have typically, I say typically because it can be much higher depending on the nature of the leave, typically about 12 weeks of protected leave for the birth or newly adopted or foster children. That has no hours requirements. I mentioned that actually is extended to part-time folks as well. That's unusual. So FEMLA doesn't have that same flexibility. We also have a much larger group of people who are covered in terms of the additional folks that you might need to take leave for. So we have grandparent and grandchild. We have parents-in-law and same-sex domestic partners with a serious health condition. So that's new. Every year there's some legislature that comes along looking at siblings. That hasn't been covered yet, but it's probably pretty likely within the next few years that will be added as well. But that's the list as it stands. And of course, we have the employee's own serious health condition, but then this one is unique to Oregon, as far as I know, which is the Sick Child Act. So that's definitely not in FEMLA. That is basically addressing issues like maybe a child that needs to be home just for one day for head lice or pink eye or a cold, a touch of the flu. We're not talking about a major medical leave where there's surgery or, an ongoing medical condition. It might just be a one and done. But that sick child, or what the attorneys love to call sniffly kid syndrome, obviously is something that requires parents occasionally to stay home and be there for the child because they can't go to daycare due to a fever for teething or something like that. We also are the first state, Oregon is the first state in the nation to offer 2 weeks of bereavement leave It's again unpaid, so the Oregon Family Medical Leave is not about pay. It's about just job protection, but 2 weeks of bereavement leave that are available for any one of those folks listed above, children, spouse, parent, grandparent, so on and so forth. And an employee can take up to 12 weeks of bereavement leave in a given year. So if you had a grandmother who passed and then a grandfather who passed, and heaven forbid another family member who passed that's covered under OFLA, then you could essentially take 6 weeks of bereavement leave if you needed to throughout the year. And we have the same reinstatement concerns, although more stringent than FEMLA. They have to have the former position back, an equivalent position if the job had been eliminated. There are ways to work through this if there are real challenges around performance that we can address. If there's a real concern around that, we have had situations where we have terminated due to things that came to light over the course of someone's leave through leave coverage. But it's a very, very tricky area, and it's not recommended to do that without some serious support from legal. WFLA, Washington Family Medical Leave, really is specifically addressing pregnancy. So pregnant females, 1,250 hours in the past 12 months will receive an additional 12 weeks of state family medical leave in addition to their pregnancy disability leave. So this is addressing both the time when we sometimes have issues coming up in pregnancy, and also setting aside time for bonding with the child as well. So we have 1,250 hours in the past 12 months also carved out for care of a domestic partner. And that's because, again, at a federal level at this point, we've only recently seen an increased definition of FEMLA to include domestic partners, married, a spouse basically being extended, that definition being extended. So most states will have some kind of a law that carves out protections for domestic partners, because that's a recent change with the repeal of the domestic, for DOMA rather. So that's a kind of a new area for us that we're expanding into, but both Washington and Oregon have already rushed to offer those protections as well. When we're talking about leave relating to an employee's own serious health condition, so their own situation, not a parent's or a child's, we're talking about maybe an illness, injury, impairment, or condition. The things that we're looking for that kind of trigger leave are anything that requires inpatient or constant care. So if they're in the hospital, if they're there for a while, anything that's terminal, of course, anything that involves a period of incapacity of 3 or more calendar days, or the inability to perform essential job functions, 2 or more treatments, or 1 treatment plus a regimen of care, or multiple treatments. So where this gets really tricky is most managers and many HR folks seize on that number 3. So number 3 or more calendar days. This is often assumed to be 3 days in a row, which isn't always the case. So if you look at the bullet points that follow, if I'm someone who suffers from chronic migraines and I go in on April 4th for a discussion with my doctor, we're trying out some treatments, things aren't working out really well, I go in 6 months later, we try a different kind of a medication, that right there fits the definition of 1 treatment and regimen of care or multiple treatments. So you can have those chronic conditions that don't necessarily mean I'm hospitalized or I have missed 3 days in a row from work. That can trigger you into, a FEMLA or OFLA situation or WFLA situation if it's pregnancy related. So you really want to be careful. I think the general default is to err on the side of providing the paperwork and letting the doctor say this does not qualify. So our medical certification form takes care of reviewing all of the different factors that might be at play and the nature of the employee's need for leave. And it's up to the doctor to decide whether or not they fit the definition. This employee's situation fits the definition of a serious health condition, a chronic condition, so on and so forth. So it would be a good idea to put on your list of things to do if you haven't familiarized yourself with the medical certification form that Xenium uses. Take a peek at that and review it closely. And then certainly as Sherry is getting those completed forms back in, and reviewing them for completion. She's got a great eye for detail, so she will flag for us if there's follow-up questions. There's often kind of a give and take with the doctors to say, what did you mean by this? Or more often than not, hey, you missed number 5. So just be aware that there's often follow-up on these things, but that we, try to get as much documentation and information as we can to make a decision before declining leave. Family member illnesses or injuries are always tricky. I think there's a real sense of concern for confidentiality. We're asking for information from our employees for a loved one, so it's a deeply personal process. And certainly when we have somebody who's providing care in the event of a major catastrophic situation, like, a loved one who's come down with cancer or struggling with a pregnancy, maybe losing, a baby, having a sick child, it can be very emotionally loaded. So part of our job is to provide a lot of information, but in a way that's not overwhelming. And that's a tough, tricky thing. We often go to the place of, here's everything you ever might need to know about leave. And it's important to also realize that the employees are often processing through a lot of information, related to care of their loved one at the same time too. So we do have an FAQ that we make available to them for both their own serious health conditions and of course for the family members as well, that really goes into great detail around the FEMLA, OFLA, WFLA process as well, and how things will play out. So remember that, we don't have the sibling coverage yet, but we've got same gender domestic partner, parents-in-law, grandparents, and grandchildren under the OFLA coverage, with siblings maybe in the offing in the near future. The sick child one is one that really has people in knots a lot of the time. So a child, the definition of a child probably doesn't baffle you that much. That's probably pretty common. But the biggest area of concern here is that the nature of whether we can require paperwork or not. So leave is available to care for a child suffering from an illness or injury that requires home care and is not a serious health condition. We can ask for documentation after 3 instances within a year, whatever the employer has designated as their year, be it a calendar year, an anniversary year, a rolling forward, rolling backward, all these various FEMLA, OFLA measuring sticks. Basically within the course of whatever we've established for the 365-day of leave tracking period, if there are 3 instances where an employee's child has been sick in that calendar year, we can request documentation each and every time thereafter. You can do that through the form of a medical certification or purely just asking for a doctor's note. I'll tell you, in my experience, most employers are not militant about this because it is such a paperwork nightmare, and we want to make sure we're applying it evenly. So if we ask Molly for paperwork every time her child is out, we need to be asking, other folks for the same paperwork. So most employers are not pressing for documentation. That doesn't mean that they can't. I've got several clients who do. We just want to make sure we're keeping track of that and ensuring that there is equity in who we're challenging for paperwork each time. So this is probably all pretty straightforward around leave relating to pregnancy, maternity, and childbirth. We're looking at both short-term situations like maybe morning sickness, and of course all of those doctor's appointments that are folded into these this need for leave. So we do have the prenatal care folded in as well as the routine OB appointments. And then I think the big surprise for people, we tend to think about 12 weeks of leave for parental bonding, and that would start on day 1 when that baby arrives. But the reality is that we can, for a woman, if the employee is a female who is pregnant, we can actually have some post childbirth. So basically, there's the prenatal and then there's the postpartum recovery period. Most doctors, as a rule of thumb, will allow for a postpartum recovery, or would indicate and secure for a woman postpartum recovery date of 6 weeks for a vaginal delivery and 8 weeks for a C-section. So most women, right off the bat, if they were to pursue this with their providers, would have an additional 6 to 8 weeks of leave on top of the 12 weeks of parental bonding, to just get to know the baby, be home and care for the newborn. Now, if the only exception to that is if the employee has had a really rough pregnancy leading up to their delivery, in which case they may have exhausted those 12 weeks already. If they were on bed rest for 3 months prior to delivery, or had chronic illnesses related to that, then that might preempt some of that postpartum time. But again, then you get into areas of, disability where we probably would be accommodating leave anyway. So when we tell someone that they have 12 weeks of baby bonding time and they're a female employee, typically their provider, if the employee pursued it, would be giving them additional time off if they requested it. Both parents are entitled to that leave for the birth of a child. So in this case, dads are not the ones carrying the child. They don't have the additional time beforehand, but they certainly do have the ability to stay home with the new baby for baby bonding for 12 weeks following the birth of a child, adoption, fostering, so on and so forth. That time is available for both the first 12 months of a newborn's life, and it's also available for 12 months following adoption or fostering. And that's a really important time. And I think a nature of a leave that's probably underutilized, and that folks aren't aware of. The leave is available to that employee anytime within the first 12 months. Most employers, though, will not allow intermittent baby bonding leave, so parental bonding leave. The reason be that can actually become a very clever cover for not having daycare. So I'm sorry, I'm going to have to leave at 4 instead of at 5 on Tuesday because I need my baby bonding time, when it might just be an issue of daycare coverage. So most employers would, and we do in this case, this one case, only with parental leave, we have the ability to dictate whether the employee takes it as a consecutive leave, meaning one chunk of time when you go out on leave, and when you come back from leave, you're done with your leave, even if you have more leave available in your bank. So if you stayed home with the baby for the first, 4 weeks, and then you return to work, the rest of your leave, the remaining 2 months or, 8 weeks of leave is gone. It's not there for you because it's for parental bonding and you've already returned to work. We do have the ability to structure it that way. The employer can also allow some intermittent parental bonding, but we want to make sure that they're aware that this does actually open them up to a leave that rolls along and rolls along and rolls along for the next year. Because if it's an hour here or an hour there, it becomes a situation that's kind of easily stretched into daycare. So be aware of that. The rule of thumb, not the rule of thumb, the best practice is to require consecutive parental leave. And then leave may be available to satisfy other obligations of a parent. Most notably, California has long had a leave around attending meetings at school, which I personally have taken advantage of if I here in Oregon. So those of us who have children who are sitting in the office a lot would really like to have a leave like that in Oregon here. Another common one is summons of custodial parent to juvenile court. So if there's an issue that results in police action, time away from work to support your child and work through those situations as well might be covered. Oregon sick leave. So this is the situation that as I speak right now, we're still all abuzz about. And I hope that by the time you listen to this, we have all settled and nailed down. Basically, Oregon sick leave passed back in July. The rules, back in July of 2015, I should say. The rules and regulations were ironed out at the end of November of 2015, and we had a month to put this monster into play for all of our employers. Many employers had a head start. If they were based in Portland, they already had a form of almost identical leave. In fact, the Oregon sick leave is based on the Portland sick leave with a few more employer-friendly elements and a few more employee-friendly elements. And we're going to go through those. Most notably, the rest of the state, so anybody outside of the city of Portland, has a 10 or more threshold. So if you have 10 or more employees, you're required to provide them with 40 hours of paid leave. The threshold in Portland is actually a little bit different. So if you have 6 or more paid employees, you have, 6 or more employees, you have paid leave. If you have fewer than 6, if you have 5 or fewer, then it's unpaid leave. Or outside of Portland, it's 9 or fewer. Then the time is still granted, but it is purely more like a FMLA-OFLA. It's an unpaid leave of absence that just provides job protection for folks. So those are the two big ones. The new law for the state of Oregon very closely follows OFLA in terms of qualifying absences and covered family members. So they work really well together, and it's easy to kind of refer from one to the other as well. Oregon sick leave versus Portland sick leave. So we talked about the threshold differences. With the Oregon sick leave going into play, it preempted the Portland sick leave in all areas except for that threshold piece. There's no real changes then for Portland employers, except for the 240-hour eligibility threshold that used to be in play for the Portland sick leave is now gone. So we used to require that an employee worked 240 hours in the city limits of Portland before they were eligible for sick leave, and that could take, for part-time folks or substitute teachers or on-call staff, that could take the entire year, so it might never come into play for them. But in this case, that's gone now. You can require a 90-day wait period where they would not be eligible until the 91st day to use the leave that they have accrued, but they're accruing it from day one. The 240 hours, though, is no longer a legitimate expectation. Also, Oregon sick leave clarifies that if you have an accrual system, then you have a cap of 40 hours that you can use in the course of a year, whatever the employer sets as their year. For schools, it might be the school year. For some companies, it's the anniversary year, so an employee's date of hire to the next, anniversary of their employment. Most commonly, we see either anniversary year or calendar year, so January 1st through December 31st. If you have an accrual, though, after year one, you have to allow them to roll over up to 80 hours, not just 40, but 80 hours into their bank. And that's to allow for maybe a slow accrual where someone has very, they're going just with the minimum of 1 hour per every 30 hours worked. Right in the middle of cold and flu season, of course, if you're doing a calendar year, January 1st rolls around. If we were to take away all of their accrued leave, they might be, down to a blank of 0. That's not allowed because, of course, if they get sick in January, February, March, they haven't accrued very much leave at all. So we want to make sure that we're scrutinizing our clients' policies for that 80-hour cap. They can go much higher if they want to. If they want to have no cap on the accrual or a cap of 120 or whatever makes sense for them, that's fine. But it cannot be a cap of 40 hours, or certainly cannot be a situation where the employees are losing all of their accrued leave, even by choice. So even if it's a cash out, that would be a no-no. We have to allow them to roll over at least 80 hours from year to year. Use and notice. We have a couple of options in terms of how employees can use the time. The law's main concern is that people not be overly penalized or have an over deduction from their leave. So if I'm leaving at 11 o'clock and I'm an exempt employee, and I'm heading out sick, let's say, it's very common to see exempt employees employers allowing employees to take 4-hour increments rather than hour by hour. So they're recognizing that an exempt employee is not an hour by hour employee. So they're saying, look, if you leave early and you're gone for more than 4 hours, then we'd like to debit, 4 hours from your sick leave or your PTO. But if you leave early and it's less than 4 hours, then don't even worry about it. However, for non-exempt employees, hourly employees, we definitely want to see a 1-hour increment. The undue hardship, I've heard from many, many attorneys, you're not going to win that one. It's very, very unlikely for an employer to have success in basically saying, look, We want to go, we want to have basically larger deductions from an employee's account. We can't let them off in 1 hour increments. So really erring on the side of generosity and saying we're just going to go hour by hour or in 4 hour increments for exempt employees makes a lot more sense. On the notice piece, that is actually a shift. The foreseeable leave is actually a shift from the old Portland sick leave law. So we now are saying we'd like to have up to 10 days notice. And certainly for unforeseeable leave as soon as practicable. So be really careful about disciplining folks who are ill and came down, with some kind of an awful virus that day, because it's not leave that was foreseeable. So it's pretty closely guarded area. This piece around requiring a note is very interesting. The new Oregon sick leave laws, new as in contrast from Portland sick leave, tried to be much more definite about when they were requiring leave. If it's been more than 3 days of leave, you can request a doctor's note. Keep in mind that they're almost, at that point, if they're being allowed 40 hours of leave, they're almost through their paid leave at that stage. So it may not be worth the battle. It might be worth just, essentially accepting the note and moving, or accepting the absence on its face value and moving forward. If you do suspect an abuse situation, so multiple employees or coworkers have come to you and said, so-and-so's not really sick, they're posting pictures on their Facebook of themselves skiing at Timberline, then certainly you can request a note. But it would be really good to have those concerns be a chronic situation, or multiple people stating that they saw the employee out partying or what have you, and preferably not involving social media. If there's a pattern of using sick time near weekends, holidays, vacation days, and paydays, then that certainly can come up too. We want to be really careful here. Honestly, this is not something I would want to toy with if we're not having, certainly the pattern of abuse or what have you. You want to involve an attorney at that point, or a senior business partner or director in this situation, to make sure that we're moving to escalate in a way that is appropriate and doesn't appear to be retaliatory. Leave related to military service. So we covered this a little bit relating to FEMLA. Absences can be in whole or in part for servicemen and women who are involved in active duty or inactive duty training, military fitness exams, funeral honors, disaster response, attendance at military academy. Also, the revised FEMLA laws and many of the individual state laws have recognized that the burden that's placed upon the families of military members is also pretty significant. So if spouses or domestic partners have need of new housing or attending classes or support networks, when there is an impending call or order to active duty or close to leaves or deployments, then that can certainly be another reason for leave. So I might not be an active member of the military myself, but if my spouse is and is called up for duty, then I might need time off to arrange for childcare, maybe moving, relocating, things like that. Attending classes around coping, things like that. So it's actually one of the least commonly addressed leaves that we have. We don't often have requests for it, but we want to be certainly very sensitive to the need for leave in these areas when things come up, of course. The other side of this, of course, is when we have someone who is acting as a caregiver for someone who was injured in the line of duty. So essentially, if you have someone who's providing care for a covered service member for medical treatment, recuperation, or therapy, that can go on for years, which is why under FEMLA you see an extended timeline of 26 weeks. For a serious service-related illness or injury, or any of the above, we want to make sure we're exploring the appropriate leaves. The qualifying exigency leave I kind of spoke to in the last slide, but essentially if there's need for kind of coordinating life around the absence of a spouse, who's called up for leave, or even a child or parent, then the following outlined options might be prompting the need for leave for an employee. So short notice deployments, military events and activities, school and childcare activities, financial and legal arrangements, counseling, R&R, and then post-deployment activities as well, all might trigger a leave. Most states have a domestic violence law, certainly both Oregon and Washington do, as well as California. This often extends to both victims and then parents or guardians of minors and dependents who are the victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. So this is a very loaded situation and very highly emotional for both managers and the employees that are working through these situations. So our job is basically to, if needed, some employers don't even ask for the documentation, but if we need to get the documentation, doing so in a way that's sensitive and supportive to the upheaval that follows a situation like this. And we do have documentation that we can provide somebody that, formally designates a leave related to domestic violence. Always a good idea to keep in mind, too, that if your employer or your client has the added support available through the employee assistance program, that can be invaluable in these situations, and that many insurance plans, medical insurance plans, have elements of mental counseling, mental health counseling involved as well too. So there's a whole layer of support that we can provide to folks who are in these situations as need be, that really is a more robust service than simply administering leave, which is, of course, the Xenium way. We take care of our folks, of course. So when do we review all of these different components that we've talked about so far? Certainly a big trigger is when the employee needs time off for work that's 3 or more consecutive days, or if they have a chronic condition that comes up as well or needs multiple treatments. Or if they have a family member that needs support in that area. Also, if we have time required for a sick child in more than 3 separate occasions in a 12-month period, we can ask for the documentation around that. Or if they're requesting leave related to military matters as well too. Things get more complex when the injury happened as relates to work. We want to make sure we're being very careful not to discriminate against an injured worker who applies for benefits. And that also applies in the post or the pre-interview, screening process. If somebody listed on their application that they left work because they had a work comp injury, left a prior employer, we want to be very sensitive to whether that application is handed out to the hiring managers. We do have requirements in most states around reinstatement following a work comp injury. And we want to make sure that if we have the option to return them to light duty and can do so safely per their doctor, that we do so. There can be significant financial savings here. And if this is a client that is working within Xenium's safety program, just know that our wonderful work comp guru, Heidi, will be all over looking at whether or not we can get that person back to work quickly. So we've got a great team here that supports their healing and recovery by getting them back to work. There are many, many studies that show that getting back to work more quickly prompts a faster recovery than staying home. So your body is kind of staying in the routine of the day-to-day, and it actually speeds your recovery to come back. So if the doctors are open to that and the employee is able to return to either their existing job or something that's slightly modified, then that's always a fabulous situation. And of course, they have rights whether or not they can do the original job. So they have to be returned, even if they aren't able to do their original job. If we have other jobs that we can offer them, we're going to be exploring that. And this process is all being orchestrated, usually in cooperation with our work comp insurer who manages the claims, and it's in their interest to get the employee back to work safely too. There's probably going to be an expectation management process between Heidi and the HR business partner or account rep on the manager side or the owner side in terms of whether or not we can return that employee. And Heidi's, again, brilliant at navigating you through that. Interestingly, one thing that we want to keep in mind here is that work comp claims are excluded from OFLA, but included with FEMLA. So that gets very, very complex. So we mentioned that OFLA, or I mentioned earlier that OFLA tends to be more generous than FEMLA. That is the case. With OFLA, what the state is essentially saying is we're not going to require you to tap into your leave bank. So you have these 12 weeks available through Oregon Family Medical Leave Act. This injury occurred as a result of the work you're doing for your employer. We're not going to penalize you by requiring you to use your work comp lost time when you're sitting at home recovering from an injury. You're not tapping into that bank. So that way, if you were later that year to get pregnant or need a surgery that's totally unrelated, so maybe you have a back injury that occurred at work, but you need to have an extensive hernia operation, completely unrelated, then we're not going to tap into that bank. You still have those 12 weeks untouched. But meanwhile, at the same time, you've got FEMLA chugging along, and FEMLA does not have these same exclusions. So how we handle that is within our paperwork. When we have a work comp claim, whether it's been approved or not, even if it's kind of out there still, hasn't been accepted, we have paperwork that we can send off that will just trigger from Sherry that notes that in the event that the work comp claim is denied, we will be going back and designating OFLA. So we would send it out in FEMLA situations where there's a work comp case pending, and then we would essentially say, in that paperwork, but if it turns out to be OFLA related, then we'll come back and add the OFLA time in as well as FEMLA. Really important reminder that we want to just keep in front of our managers. There are no magic words. Employees almost never say, I believe I have need of the Family Medical Leave Act, please. While they have to provide sufficient notice, there's no magic words. So you'll often hear, hey, I've got a surgery coming up, or, gosh, I've been sick again. I've had these migraines over and over and over again. I'm going to have to miss work. So if we have three absences, that's when we want to look at that. But there's certainly not often very clear, definite communication that lays out the fact that we're dealing with a FEMLA or OFLA or WFLA situation. And essentially, we're responsible for being hypervigilant and watching for that because the employees are not responsible. So basically the employee putting us on notice can come through a whole variety of communications. And the same is true of ADA. You're not going to hear from an employee most often, hey, I have ADHD. It's going to be something like, I have trouble concentrating and I'm really struggling. So being able to navigate that conversation with an employee in a way that doesn't have you in the role of playing doctor or perceiving a disability, but talking about what can we do, what kind of support can we get, what do you need, and then we'll follow this up with some documentation for your doctor so we can get some recommendations to help you. So we have magic words we're using on our end, but don't expect them to come from your employees, unfortunately. When in doubt, we're not going to say, no, you don't qualify for leave. No, we aren't going to help you with getting a new monitor if you can't see the one that you have. Of course, everybody knows this on the HR side, so it's just reminding your clients that the answer is always, let me check on that. Let me research. The laws just change. I don't really know much about the Oregon sick leave yet because you're my first scenario that I'm running through on that. So, really letting your clients know that this is an incredibly complex area and they don't have to be experts on it, but they do have to be experts on putting on the brakes when discipline is at hand and something is said in these areas, or, certainly not terminating for attendance when someone has chronic issues, related to something that could be covered under Oregon sick leave or FEMLA or OFLA. We also want to make sure that we're doing our job well. And those clients that we work with that are leaning on Xenium to provide them with support for safety or for leave management processes are obviously going to be in great shape. You'd never catch us providing incomplete notice to employees or failing to properly designating leave. We keep great records, and we've worked really hard with the payroll team to make sure that we've got record keeping abilities for even the unpaid organ sick leave. We will always handle reinstatement respectfully, and be, of course, mindful of what both the client and the employee want, as well as what the law is dictating that we do too. We will, of course, train our managers and our supervisors and our leads around the dangers of retaliation and breach of confidentiality. So that's a lot of responsibility on the HR business partner, but you've got a massive team behind you that's ready to support you in making sure that all this happens as it needs to and plays out well. Just a reminder on the confidentiality piece, we really try to hone in on this for the managers and give them specific talking points about how to respond to questions around leave, or if there's a performance issue related to a disability. So it's a nice little reference that we have available. We also have a wonderful reference, incidentally, for when we can require doctor's notes too. So we have that saved on the Villa. You can explore it at your leisure. Discipline. So this is one area we'll be working very closely with the clients if there is an issue where an employee who has had a recent leave or work comp issue, that we'll be carefully monitoring to make sure that we're not retaliating in any way, and certainly creating a paper trail that demonstrates that we're not retaliating. So this slide is intended to really dispel the myth that we cannot terminate somebody who's had a recent leave or work comp injury. We just have to be super, super careful. That last bullet point there, documenting performance in a timely manner, is one that I tend to just hammer home when I'm talking to managers. It seems like kismet or fate or who knows what. Something always happens when you have that difficult conversation with an employee that you've been putting off. That's the employee who's going to fall and slip on the ice and dislocate a shoulder, at which point you can't really necessarily approach them with a whole bunch of quality, safety, and teamwork concerns without it kind of crossing their mind that, gosh, this is right on the heels of my work comp injury. Feels kind of retaliatory. So really having those conversations timely and documenting them is extremely important, because it seems like those are always the employees that, through simple twists of fates, wind up being the respondent in a harassment complaint, or the complainant in a harassment situation, or a work comp injury, or needing a sudden leave of absence as well. So final thoughts and reminders and tips here. A lot of this work and heavy lifting is on the manager's shoulders. So the more that we as an HR team can stay out ahead, offer this training, reinforce what can be said, what can't be said, and then certainly if you're new to the ADA process, working very closely with your director or senior HR business partners, or with the leadership team here at Xenium, to make sure that we're handling it carefully, liaisoning with legal, of course, to make sure that we're taking care of the elements that we need to from a documentation perspective, and thinking outside the box on accommodations if it's an ADA situation. This is a really complex world that we're navigating through. I would add that for me, it's one of the single most fulfilling and meaningful things that I do every day. When an employee comes to me and says that their husband has terminal cancer and is in tears, the last thing that I want to do is to slap them with a bunch of impersonal forms and requirements for communication. So being able to support an employee with empathy, with compassion, but also with thorough, well-documented processes and expectations for communication, feels really good. It feels like being able to both relieve a burden and create some protections and structure around a really scary time of life for many people. So being able to do it well is a point of pride that we all here at Xenium share. We've crafted our communication around both ADA and OFLA, FEMLA at least, to be more supportive than what you would see coming from most employers. We're very clear about the expectations and the timelines about what needs to be turned in when, but the forms are approachable and they make sense. And of course, there's nothing like a personal touch from each of you to make that even more meaningful. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation and walkthrough and training. Please come see me if you have any questions about anything I've said. And know that these are shifting sands, so things change daily. Your manager can also follow up with you as well. And we thank you so much for the time and attention you've given us today.